If you're enjoying this podcast from us here at Which, then why not become a Which member? Right now, we've got a special offer, especially for podcast listeners, meaning you can choose any of our 3 membership tiers for 50% off the usual price. Starting at just £39.50 for a full year, you can get Which magazine delivered direct to your door. For the same price, you could also choose a digital Which subscription, giving you access to all of our product reviews, the Which app, and the digital edition of Which magazine. What's more, you'll also be able to use the Ask Which service for personalised one-to-one buying advice. Or why not get a full access Which subscription for just £49.50 for a full year? Don't forget, that's 50% off the usual price. To join Which or to find out more, just head to which.co.uk/podcast offer. That's which.co.uk/podcast offer, or click the link in the description for today's podcast for 50% off a Which annual subscription.
When life gives you questions, Which? Get answers.
Welcome to the Which Money Podcast, your weekly hit of money news and personal finance hacks to help make you better off. I'm your host, Lucia Ariano, and here's what's coming up this week.
I remember once I had a client years ago again when I was in private practice who had worked for a long time and they'd taken dividends as an employee and they'd never had these shares valued. When they died, they were worth about £4 million. They had no idea they were worth this much money, and their family were just totally shocked.
We would say that there's on average about 15% of wills at probate tend to include a gift. But if you were to increase that to about 20%, that would equate to another £1.3 billion of funding for good causes.
This week, we're looking at wills. Now, it may seem like something you don't need to think about right now, and understandably that you just don't want to have to think about it. But the general advice is that everybody should have one just in case. So, what are they? What should they include? And how should you go about making one? Well, joining us to answer these questions and plenty more are James Buchan, a wills expert here at Which, and Lucinda Frostick, the director of Remember a Charity, which is a group representing 200 charities that encourage more people to leave a gift to charity in their will. Well, welcome so much to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Well, shall we start then with some of the basics? James, can you define what a will actually is?
It's quite a simple thing, really. A will is a written document that you make and what's called execute, which is a legal term for you sign and have it witnessed whilst you're alive. And it basically has to be, like I said, to be in written form. It still has to be an actual document. It can't be a digital document or a digital signature or anything on those lines. But it basically sets out what's going to happen with your estate and your assets once you've died and who's going to deal with everything on your behalf.
And I feel like there might be this idea that, you know, not everybody needs one, that you only need one when you get to a certain age or if you have certain possessions.
Yep.
That's not the case, is it? What's your advice here?
No, I mean, I think nobody has to make a will. Let's put that one out there. There's no requirement for anybody to make a will. But if you don't make a will, your estate ends up with something called the intestacy rules, which are a strict set of rules as to who will inherit and what they will inherit. Whereas if you make a will, you can have the testamentary freedom in order to stipulate who should receive what in your will. A lot of people think, I don't need to make a will, I'm too young, and all those sorts of statements that you do hear people make, and that's not quite correct. There's lots of things that you can do in a will in order to protect, for example, a cohabitee. So if you are unmarried, you're not in a civil partnership, the intestacy rules don't recognise that, so your partner, who you may have lived with for a long time, wouldn't inherit anything under your estate. So you can make a will in order to protect them. But yeah, a will is something that if you own property, you own assets, you should really have a will, because then it's you saying what you want to happen to your estate when you do die.
Could I jump in on the back of that, actually? Because that was so brilliantly answered. But I also thought that perhaps one of the other things that we can think about in terms of when people, why it's so important to have a will, as James said, absolutely, it's freedom of choice, but it is also about kind of removing that uncertainty or distrust you might leave behind for those that you love after you're gone. And I guess as somebody who I have to admit, I did procrastinate a little bit about writing my own will. But I would just say it also doesn't have to be all doom and gloom. It is absolutely that document that you use to set out your wishes after you're gone. But it's also can be incredibly empowering and uplifting, because it's an opportunity to not just to sort of sort out business matters, if you like, but to remember all those that you care about, loved ones and good causes alike.
And Lucinda, at Remember a Charity, are you seeing lots of people with wills later on in life, earlier on in life? How is it kind of looking to you? I
think you're right in that the earlier conversations we had, James and Lucia, were where we talked about sort of people burying their head in the sand and wanting to sort of avoid writing a will. I think that is a really key issue. It's a job that's far too easy to put off. As I said, I certainly did with mine for far too long. And I think figures really vary around the level of wills in the UK, but certainly the latest data I've seen from the IRN shows that around 2/3 of adults don't actually have a will. And of course, that take-up will increase with age, and it becomes more prominent, more important with age. And as people pass through different key life stages, getting married, having children, losing a loved one, and also divorce and that sort of thing. So I think it is really, really important to consider not only writing a will, but also updating your will at various key stages during life. And actually, quite encouragingly, what I did want to add as well is we've done a consumer tracking study dating back since about 2014. And we can see that there is a very slow incremental increase in will writing amongst the group that we monitor, which is those aged over 40. But it's very slow.
And while we're on this point of quite few people making a will, not enough people, can we just touch on what could go wrong then if you don't have a will?
Do you know what you see? Kind of, I don't want to be a doom and gloom lawyer here, but unfortunately, you do see some situations where. As I touched on earlier, unmarried partners don't have any rights. And I when I was working in private practice, I had an estate once where the gentleman had died. He didn't have a will, and his partner, who he'd been with over 20 years, was living in the property, but she had no right to remain in that property. She wasn't entitled under an intestacy. He would have wanted her to be able to stay in the property and have somewhere to live, but unfortunately, the intestacy laws don't enable that. We were able to sort something out for him, and with talking to the actual beneficiaries talking to the actual beneficiaries that did inherit, but they were very pleasant, very reasonable people. And unfortunately, some people aren't very pleasant and aren't unreasonable, and don't necessarily have to be either. So it can be quite difficult, and there can be lots of uncertainty. Particularly, if you have people who under an intestacy who may not have mental capacity to act as your executor or your administrator, who then would actually deal with things. And it can become quite messy and quite complicated at what is, a very emotional time. Somebody has died and there's lots going on in their own life, and they're then having to deal with grief and deal with these issues which could have been prevented.
And the same also goes, doesn't it, for any stepchildren?
That's right,
foster children?
Yeah, potentially. So, under an intestacy, it's your blood line, if you like. So if you have a stepchild, they might not necessarily be included in that automatically. Foster children, won't be included in that as well. So, it's important that when you think about making a will, who you wanting to look after, who you wanting to protect. And if you do have, we see nowadays lots of, blended families, if you like, and multiple marriages and all those sorts of things where it's not straightforward. It's very important to actually get your affairs in order. And it may be that you don't have a lot in terms of a lot of assets, but that actually then makes it more important that you want to make sure that they really are going to look after the people that you want to be taken care of.
Well, let's get into the will writing then, shall we? Shall we talk about what to put in and also, what not to put in? James, where would you start?
I think my favourite gift I ever saw in a will was a gentleman that left his friend 20 quid, quote, so he could buy a round of drinks, as he'd known him 20 years and he'd never bought a round of drinks. So that was my favourite. That's my favourite gift that I've ever seen. But really, you want to kind of think about who is going to be your executors, so who is going to administer, who's going to look after everything for you, who's going to administer your estate and deal with everything. If you have children, you can appoint guardians, so that would be the people that would care for your children if you and their other parent were no longer around, and that's on people under 18, obviously for minors. And then there's things like gifts, so gifts of items, so you might have personal items like jewellery that you might have to leave to people, gifts of cash. Charitable gifts, if you wanted to leave, cash legacies or items that you wanted to leave to charity. Gifts of property, you can include a gift of a house, for example, if you wanted to. And then what's something called the residue, and residue is what's left after everything else. So it's normally the bulk of an estate, but not always. But basically after any liabilities have been paid, any debts, gifts and all these things have all been paid, it's what's left. And that's kind of where, who's going to get that, so to speak, as well. There are also other things that I wouldn't recommend you don't include in a will. So things like if you're excluding somebody, you do see people say, I'm not leaving so-and-so anything. I wouldn't put that in a will. You can always write a separate note saying why you're not doing that, but I wouldn't put that in a will, simply because a will become a public document at some point, and you don't necessarily want the world to know about your
You just don't need to put
issues,
it in
and it doesn't need to be there. And you do see people sometimes saying, I'm leaving so-and-so zero, don't do that. And, you do get also people saying, I'm leaving someone £5,000, and that if, as long as they don't claim on my estate, they can have that. I wouldn't include those sort of gifts. If you're not wanting to leave somebody into something, don't leave them, don't include them.
And I suppose people might think that their property, their house, their flat might be the number one thing. Would you agree with that?
In the vast majority of cases, yes, property is normally our biggest asset. But, there are other things that you may have, like a pension, like a life policy. I remember once I had a client years ago, again, when I was in private practice, who had worked for a long time, and they'd taken dividends as an employee and taken share employees and scrip dividends and all those sorts of things. And they'd never had these shares valued. When they died, they were worth about £4 million. They had no idea they were worth this much money, and their family were just totally shocked. And that's actually quite a risk. They've got £4 million in a company. All that company needs is one bad product, and then that could potentially be, a very difficult situation. So, yeah, it's very important to understand what you have and how much you've got, or how much you don't have. Some people, I've seen wills where people are leaving like gifts of thousands of pounds, and actually they don't have an awful lot of money, and you think, actually, is this kind of really what you want? So it's really important that people understand their estate before they make their will.
And you mentioned pensions and life insurance policies there.
Yeah.
Shall we bring those in then?
Yeah,
and
can do.
How do they feature or kind of maybe don't feature as much as you'd expect in wills?
The rule of thumb, and you can tell I'm a lawyer because I keep saying things like normally and potentially, but normally...
covering all bases.
Yeah, covering all bases and covering myself. Normally, pensions and life policies don't form part of an estate, and people think that sounds a bit weird, and it's generally because a pension and a life policy isn't something that you actually own. It's held normally by pension trustees or life policy trustees. And so what you normally do is with those providers, whoever it may be, you have a nomination. So you nominate those assets to various people. So say I had a life policy for £200,000 and I nominated it to my wife, for example. What would then happen is on my death, they wouldn't pay the money to my estate, to me, if you like, as the deceased. They would pay it directly to my wife. And so it actually falls outside of the estate. So my biggest point would be, if you've got a pension, if you've got a life policy, make sure you have it nominated. Make sure you contact the provider, get what they call a nomination form, or however it is they may do it. It might be digital, and make sure it is nominated to people, because if it isn't, they may pay it to somebody that you might not want it to be paid to.
Well, it's a good time then to talk about why that might be a problem because of inheritance tax and what that is and when you start paying it. And actually, I feel like we should stress that most people don't pay it, do they?
No, it's a very small percentage of estates that pay inheritance tax. I can't remember what the figure was, but I think it's something like 2 or 3%. It's off the top of my head. It's quite low.
It's just up to 4.4% on the last year's figures, I believe.
Really?
Yeah. So yeah, it's very low, but I think it's one of those and Lucinda, you'll probably agree, it's one of those emotive taxes that people kind of, you see it a lot in, press and publications about, there's a lot of fuss made about inheritance tax, but it is a very small percentage of estates that pay inheritance tax.
I mean, Lucinda, do you find that people worry? Do you often come across people worrying that they might be paying inheritance tax, wrongly or rightly?
Yes, but I think it's really interesting because I guess the conversations I'm having are very different to those that James would be having. And when people have these sort of conversations with me, actually they're kind of approaching charitable giving through their will as an opportunity to, they're unlikely to leave money to charity in their will specifically because they want to reduce the inheritance tax burden, but they'll be coming at it from that angle going, oh, I want to include a gift and I understand there are tax benefits of doing so. How can that help? So it's a slightly different kind of conversation that I tend to be having with the public that might reach out to us, or indeed through advisors. Solicitors and will writers will often approach us with similar sort of questions and inquiries as well, because it's a very kind of popular a conversation between them and their clients.
So we've said that, most people won't be having to pay inheritance tax. Just to kind of make it clear, what is that threshold? What's the figure that you'd need to?
So the magical 325,000 figure, which we've had since about 2009, it hasn't moved since then. So we all have a personal allowance of 325,000. So we can have up to 325,000 before we pay any inheritance tax in our estates. If you're a husband and wife or civil partners, you also have something called a transferable allowance. So let's say husband and wife, husband dies first, we'll knock him down by a bus. Everything goes to the wife on his death. And then when she dies, she has, in effect, two people's estates in her estate. She can claim her husband's unused nil rate band. Right. So she'd have 650,000. If they have a property or have had a property that would have gone to what's called lineal descendants, so children, grandchildren, for example, there is also another allowance called the residence nil rate band, which is another £175,000, which again is transferable between spouses and civil partners. So that makes it 350,000. So for spouses, civil partners, it's up to £1 million if there is a property involved somewhere on the line.
Just to jump in on that then, James, please correct me if I get it wrong, because I'm by no means a professional advisor. But gifts to charity are, of course, tax-free. And the other thing to bear in mind is that if you leave a gift of 10% or more of the net value of your estate, that it can actually reduce the inheritance tax rate. So it comes down by another 10%. So in other words, it comes down to 36%. Which doesn't sound like an awful lot, I know, but actually can make a significant difference. So it's very appealing.
Well, after a quick break, we'll be talking more about the terminology, about charities, about who can benefit from your will, as well as things like power of attorney and letters of wishes.
Are you thinking about the future and how to protect your loved ones? Creating a will is one of the most important steps you can take to ensure your wishes are carried out and your family is taken care of. That's why we're excited to tell you about a very special offer from Which Wills. Which Wills offers a straightforward, affordable and trusted service for writing your will. Whether you need a simple will or something more complex, our expert team is here to help you every step of the way. With Which Wills, you get access to legal professionals who can answer your questions on a one-to-one basis, customizable options to suit your specific needs and circumstances, and peace of mind knowing that your will is legally sound and your wishes will be respected. You can start the process from the comfort of your own home. Just visit whichwills.which.co.uk/premium-30 to get started. That's whichwills.which.co.uk/premium-30. And if you purchase before the 30th of September, you will get 30% off Which's premium will service. Don't put it off any longer. Secure your family's future today.
Now then, let's get back into it. So we've talked a lot about what to include in your will, but what about who is going to benefit? Is it just a case of listing your cash and possessions and naming who you'd like to receive them? I suppose it comes to that point of terminology and how watertight this document needs to be.
Yeah, that's right. And there's advantages to things being watertight, but there can also be disadvantages to making things too prescriptive, and that can actually cause difficulties. And it's, as I was saying earlier, about people that leave lots of gifts in their wills, but they don't factor in actually how much money they've got, and so that can create problems later on down the line. So what we would normally say is, work out what you've got and who you'd like to receive things. And it could be that you don't have any specific gifts in your will, that you may actually just leave everything in what's called the residue, and that may, for example, all go to a charity if you don't have any family members, or it may be that it goes to your family members or friends, people that you really want to benefit, with a mixture of charities. But for example, you do see people that give a gift of a bank account. That's fine, but if that bank account changes, the number changes, or you no longer bank with Lloyds, for example, you change to HSBC, you need to make sure you're updating your will to make sure that is factored in.
And just to give our listeners an idea, roughly how much are we talking that it might cost to write one? It's
a difficult thing to answer because it really depends. But what I would say is that obviously most online providers, you could probably get a will for anything between £80 to £200, I would have thought. Something you buy off a shelf, you might be paying £15, £20 for. A solicitor service, obviously it very much depends on what you need. They will do fixed fee wills, but it could be actually what you need is more complex, and therefore you'd be looking at a bespoke quote. So I think what I would say is, once you've established what kind of service you think is right for you, have a ring around, get some quotes, and move forward. But what I would be also prepared for is you don't know what kind of will you might need. And that sounds like an odd thing to say, but you may need a will that has, for example, a trust in it. If you've got a child that maybe has disabilities and you want to protect things for them so that it doesn't all get swallowed up being used for things it shouldn't have been. So you may need more complicated planning and more complicated advice.
And I should also mention that if you would like to try Which's premium will service, you can get 30% off up until the end of September. Just head to whichwills.which.co.uk/premium-30. That's a mouthful, isn't it? Well, shall we come back to charities then, Lucinda? This is your domain. Could you just start us off with just an introduction to how charities work with wills? Why people might want to? I know we've already touched on it, but why people might want to give in their will.
Giving to charity from your will is nothing desperately new. This is something that's been around sort of probably for as long as wills have been. In fact, I was looking at old historic wills just yesterday and reading up about some wonderfully iconic and quirky examples of gifts to charity left in will. So it's nothing new, but I think
Give us some examples, go on.
Yeah, okay. I guess Shakespeare left £10, this princely sum of £10 to support the poor in Stratford, but he also left his second best bed to his wife, who he clearly loved a great deal.
Bed.
Where did his first best bed go, I wonder?
And another one, actually, on the Shakespeare theme, which is always one of my favourites. There's a Polish pianist called Andrzej Tchaikovsky, not to be confused with the famous composer Tchaikovsky, who left his skull to the Royal Shakespeare Company to be used because he'd always dreamt of performing on stage. And the skull, I think, only came to the stage quite recently when David Tennant performed a production of Hamlet and he was allowed to use it.
Oh my gosh, wow. Sorry, I interrupted your train of thought there, but that was interesting. I'm pleased we've heard those.
Yes, so I guess what I was saying there was that I'm having to take myself back now to the beginning of the question. Gifts and wills, it's nothing desperately new for charities. But what has really changed, particularly over the last 20 years or so, I'd say, is that they've become increasingly important to UK charities and increasingly more widespread. And I think public understanding has grown too, that this isn't something just for the wealthy to do, that we can all remember a gift to charity in our will alongside our loved ones if we wish to do so. But it is very much goes back to the point we made right at the start about it's about your will, your way, your wishes, and that's what's really crucial. But just to kind of emphasize that point around importance of this income stream to charities, I think it helps to understand that around £4 billion is now donated through gifts and wills each year. So for many charities, that now accounts for some of them, in fact, more than half of their voluntary income. So it's a huge amount of funding. And the reason that that's really important is particularly when you think back to recent years where charities have faced the challenges of COVID, economic crisis, the greater need from the public, rising costs, and therefore greater demands for services. They're battling all of this. And actually legacies have enabled them to, survive these challenging times, but also continue to provide those services, and in many cases to upscale. I've heard some wonderful examples of. I know British Heart Foundation, for example, now funds more than half of its life-saving research through gifts and wills, And actually, I was speaking to a Youth Action Trust not so long ago that was on the brink of closure and received unexpectedly a very generous legacy from a loved supporter, and that transformed life for them. They were then able to not only keep their doors open, but upscale their services for young people in the area. So it's becoming increasingly important for good causes across the UK. And just in case I haven't shared enough numbers, to give you a sense of scale, we had a record year for gifts and wills last year where there are about 38,000 charitable estates at probate in England and Wales. And that across those estates, they benefited 11,000 charities. So it's what's really lovely to see is there's greater volumes, but greater breadth as well. So more smaller and locally based organisations are benefiting too.
You answered a question that I was thinking about while you were talking. So it seems to be like it's on the up. Would that be a fair comment?
Yeah, it is on the up, and I'm delighted to say that because that's very much our mission. But it's on the up, but it's still a minority thing.
Yeah.
And I guess one of the key points that I would make is at the moment we would say that there's on average about 15% of wills at probate tend to include a gift. But if you were to increase that to about 20%, that would equate to another £1.3 billion of funding for good causes. So actually the impact on charities can be considerable. But standing back from the financial element, it's also just an incredibly powerful and wonderful way to support good causes.
And can you just give us a little bit of insight into how you might use Remember a Charity or even just kind of go about choosing a charity to leave in your will?
So Remember a Charity is a consortium of 200 charities, and we work to build public understanding and awareness around gifts and wills. So our website is a really useful resource to go to find out a little bit more information about how to give to a charity in your will, but also to read up some inspiring stories that really demonstrate that impact of charitable gifts and wills. We don't facilitate will writing. We're just there as a central resource to kind of showcase, build, inspire, and engage the public with the wonderful impact that they can make with a gift in their will.
Well, I've got a few more points that I'd like to talk about just before we wrap up. Now, this is a difficult one to talk about. It's a difficult situation where somebody might be expecting something from your will, but you don't include them. I mean, what happens in those scenarios? Can you challenge it?
This is really talking about how you would challenge a will or challenge an estate. And you get some people that come along and say, I want to make a watertight will that can never be challenged. And the headline news is that there's no such thing. So there's two ways really that you can claim against an estate. The first is to challenge the validity of the will, but there you're actually challenging that the will isn't valid. So it may not have been executed correctly, which is unlikely. First way is something is wrong with the will isn't valid. What people need to be careful with there is if the will is held to be invalid, the previous will that person testator made is then resurrected, and that might not give that person what they want either. So they need to be quite careful. The second way that you can bring a claim is under a quite grandly entitled Act of Parliament called the Inheritance Provision for Family Independence Act. And under that Act, there are categories of claimants that can bring a claim. So a spouse, a child, for example. And then there's this kind of catch-all, a person being maintained. But in order to be successful, you have to prove you are being maintained.
So that's any kind of dependent?
Yeah, so it could be even if it's somebody that might be living with you, who's, like a friend or something who's living with you and living in the house and they're living there rent-free, potentially they are being maintained because they're not paying you any rent, so they may have a claim against your estate. And you can't prevent people from bringing a claim under that Act. There's nothing you can do to stop somebody from doing it. What's important to look at is the likelihood of success. There are other things you can do as well. So, for example, you talked about somebody that might be expecting to receive something. So there's, there are, say, for example, there's really good cases where they normally relate to farms as well for some reason. But, son works on the farm and the parents say, when we die, this will all be yours. And he works on the farm to his own detriment, and then he dies and then the parents leave it wherever. He could have a claim. There's something called promissory estoppel, which basically I was promised this. He could bring a claim to say, well, I was promised that I would receive this, and that's why I did what I did. That's quite a complex one, so I won't go into more detail like that because everybody will probably start falling to sleep. But it is, there are ways that wills can be challenged. Can you stop somebody bringing a claim? No, you can't.
And letter of wishes, is that something that's kept alongside a will? I'm kind of envisaging, it's that like in a folder on your laptop, or it
Yeah.
might be with a lawyer. Is that right?
It totally depends. I mean, what I would say with the letter of wishes is letter of wishes are great. I think what people need to remember is they're not binding. So if you want a gift, for example, you need to make sure that's in your will and not in the letter of wishes, because potentially it's not going to be a gift, or it may actually cause a lot of confusion, because you may, say, is this a gift? Should it be in the will? Don't have a letter of wishes witnessed. You just need to sign it yourself. And what I would say is store it in an envelope alongside the will. Don't attach it to the will, because that can cause problems. And then it's there. And the great thing about letter of wishes, you can change it. You can change that at any time. You can take it out, rip it up, write a new one. Or if you want to store it digitally, you can store it digitally. There's nothing to stop you from doing that. What I would say is, wherever you store your will and your letter of wishes, just make sure executors know where they are so they can be found. But yeah, letter of wishes, we're seeing increasingly more people are making them. If it's just to set out where their assets are held, so where they've got bank accounts and those sort of things, you can include that. But also, why they're leaving certain items of jewellery to certain people from a sentimental value, which you wouldn't normally say in the will, why you're giving your daughter your engagement ring, but in your letter of wishes you can do, and you can put down whatever you like, really. So yeah, we're seeing them as being very popular. And especially for things like people that have children that are minors, and they want to leave instructions on how they want them to be cared for or educated and those sort of things. So letter of wishes are becoming very popular.
And another kind of piece of terminology, power of attorneys.
Yeah.
Can we just go through how they work alongside the whole wills process?
Yeah, so a lot of people do make their powers of attorney at the same time as they make their will, kind of get all of that life admin done and out of the way at the same time. But you don't have to. And powers of attorney are just as important, or really not more important than wills, because they are what cover you whilst you're still alive. So if you're alive and you can't make decisions for some reason, a financial power of attorney will give your attorneys the authority to make decisions about your money and your property. And a health power of attorney, because there's two different sorts, gives somebody the authority to make decisions about you personally. So things like where you live and who you see or who you don't see, or what you eat, or your medical care and those sort of things. Or for example, with the financial power of attorney, it could be that you're going on a cruise for a year and you need somebody to actually manage something while back home. It can be used in those sort of situations. So they're quite flexible. But yeah, my advice would be to make the powers of attorney at the same time you make your will if you don't have them, and then you kind of have it all done in one place, and make sure that you have those important documents.
Just to wrap up then, is there anything that you'd add? I think, just some advice for our listeners who maybe aren't in that percentage of people who already have up-to-date wills that they're happy with. What next?
I mean, what I would say is that making your will isn't, a lot of people think I'm just making a will and it's a document and that's it. Actually, it's a really good opportunity to do a bit of life planning and actually look at, your investments, if you have any, your bank accounts, mortgages, all those sort of things that we kind of put in a folder and we forget about. It's a really good opportunity to bring all of that out and have a really good, thorough look through and make sure that everything is correct before you then go forward and make your will and make sure your will is in place. And the other thing I would say as well is that a will isn't for life. It's really important that if you have a life-changing event, or every few years kind of drag your will out of the drawer and have a look at it and make sure it's still fit for purpose. I'm the worst culprit. I'm a solicitor and do this all the time, and I need to update my will, and I've been saying this for ages, so I'm not practicing what I'm preaching. But yeah, it's really important to make sure that you review your will and make sure it's fit for the time, and that it is for your current circumstances, and if necessary, make a new will and make sure it fits with what you need.
Just to add to that as well, I couldn't agree more. I sort of think about writing a will, rightly or wrongly, as that job you'll know you've got to do at home, whether it's cleaning out that drawer, the cupboard at the back of the house, whatever it might be, that stack of paperwork. It's that thing you need to do, and you need to revisit from time to time. But actually, it's never as painful as you think it might be, and it feels so much better to have it done. And the difference that you can make on the back of that really can be quite substantial.
And Lucinda, can you just tell us a bit more about where anyone can find you, our listeners can find you, and Remember a Charity?
Firstly, a huge thank you for having me on air with you today, because this is part of Remember a Charity Week, which is a great moment for us to kind of shine a light on the impact and the importance of gifts in wills, which is only made possible through the generosity of the public. So a huge thank you. If you want to go onto our website at rememberacharity.org.uk, you can find out lots of information about the charities that really do rely on income through gifts in wills, and read some lovely examples. In fact, just this week, we've launched a new great map of willanthropy. Willanthropy is a quirky word we use to describe the act of giving to charity from your will. It's got a serious connotation, of course, in that the traditional word of a legacy really sounds like something terribly big and grand. But through willanthropy, we're hoping to convey that this really is something that absolutely anybody can do. And the collective impact of those gifts in wills alongside gifts for your loved ones really can make a massive difference. So please do go online, find out more about what we do, and see if we can help you take action and leave your favourite charities in your will.
Amazing work you're doing. And James, a quick note on where to find more about wills at Which and Which's Wills service.
Yeah, I mean, the easiest way, if you just go to the Which Wills website, I mean, you could just Google it. If you just Google Which Wills, you'll find it there. Or the website that you quoted earlier, that will take you as well to the main website. You can see all of the information that we have there. Definitely, there is also money on our content on our money website as well, which is free for everybody to view and look at, and that provides a lot of helpful information.
Amazing, thank you. We have packed so much into today's show, and I should just shout out, we've collated a bunch of advice from reducing your household bills and planning your finances to home improvements and finding out best buys for your new home on the Which website. And to find that, you just head to which.co.uk/growing family. Well, thank you again both so much to James and Lucinda for coming on the show today.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, a huge thank you again to James and Lucinda for coming on the show today, and to you for listening to this week's episode of the Which Money podcast. If you enjoyed today's show, please do hit subscribe to make sure you catch our new episodes as soon as they drop. For daily money news and advice, you can find us on social media at Which Money and online at which.co.uk/money. And we also have a free money newsletter, which is delivered to your inbox every Monday. To sign up, visit which.co.uk/money newsletter. This episode of the Which Money podcast was written and presented by me, Lucia Ariano, and produced and edited by James Rowe.
If you're enjoying this Which podcast, then you might also be interested in listening to other podcasts that we have to offer, like Which Shorts. Which Short is our weekly podcast that brings you a flavour of what the Which magazine has to offer, as well as our dedicated travel, gardening and tech magazines too. Each week we handpick a review, investigation or feature that was printed in one of our magazines and written by one of our award-winning writers. We then bring it to life on the podcast. So to get a taster of what Which members get in our suite of magazines, be sure to listen to Which Shorts wherever you get your podcasts.